Okay. All right, awesome. So, phospholipids are a lot of fun, aren't they? What? Phospholipids? All right, what have you done? What?
Quiz tomorrow, and the quiz is over beta oxidation, ketones, and triglyceride synthesis.
Oh.
Said to focus on the enzymes and the regulatory steps.
Okay, so we've hit each of those before. So what do you guys want to do with this hour? I saw that the next one up was phospholipids, and so, but that's not on your quiz. So what would you guys like to do? We've been over, I think, beta oxidation, ketogenesis, and we did fatty acid synthesis. We haven't done tag synthesis. All right, tag synthesis then? All right. Excellent. So, tag synthesis, which honestly, tag synthesis is much nicer to learn when it's after fatty acid synthesis. Because, okay, let's see. Liver cell, oh, that's a nice, beautiful, bold markers today, courtesy of Lynn. Thank you so much. All right, so we have liver cell. The liver cell has done its deal where it takes in glucose and then it's made it into fatty acids, and it used fatty acid synthase to make those, popped out palmitic acid, these squiggles right here, and now you've got a whole bunch of squiggles floating around, and you need to know how to get those packed away in a nice, compact storage molecule known as a triacylglycerol that you can just shuttle off to the fat cells. How do we put those together? Once we have the free fatty acids made from the fatty acid synthesis pathway, then we'll need one other major ingredient, which is going to be a glycerol. So, glycerol 3-phosphate. So glycerol is a 3-carbon molecule and has a phosphate on the 3rd carbon. So this is glycerol 3-phosphate. There are 2 sources of glycerol 3-phosphate. One of them is when you take glycerol and you put a phosphate on it. It's fancy. So, does anyone want to take a stab at what kind of enzyme would add a phosphate to a molecule? Kinase. So, since it's going from a glycerol sugar to a glycerol 3-phosphate, we just call it glycerol kinase. There's one other thing that is nice to know about kinases. By the way, boxes mean enzymes unless they're on their side, in which case they're a nice backbone. This is glycerol. So glycerol kinase. Kinases have one other feature that always go with them. Anyone think of what that is? ATP. So if we see a kinase, we know that it is making or breaking an ATP. That's where it gets the phosphate from. ATP, the P of ATP is phosphate. So we take one of those off of the ATP and we put it onto the glycerol. So 1 ATP is being used and transformed into an ADP. Okay, so this enzyme, glycerol kinase, is only found in one place, the liver. No one else has it. So this particular pathway, de novo or brand new glycerol 3-phosphate, not recycled, is completely and exclusively for the liver. That was pathway 1 of getting glycerol 3-phosphate. Pathway 2 of getting glycerol 3-phosphate ready, no worries, is something that can be seen actually in the liver, because the liver does practically everything, but also in adipose or fat cells. All right. Who's seen before? DHAP. Anyone remember this guy? Glycolysis, yes. So glycolysis, halfway down, it branches into this two-way thing, and one way you get glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, the other way you get this guy, dihydroxyacetone. It's got an acetone backbone, phosphate. In glycolysis, you take this and convert it back into glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate and throw it down to pyruvate. In this case, though, you can borrow this DAP out of glycolysis if the liver wants to make more tags. It'll just steal that away. You don't make it into pyruvate. You take it and you do glycerol 3-phosphate dehydrogenase. Okay? And this will go ahead and take one NADH and turn it into NAD+. So, and what you end up with is glycerol 3-phosphate. So, for anyone who cares to know, why does a dehydrogenase do this? If you look at DAP, it's got a 3-carbon backbone, and then hydroxyls are OHs, and so it's got 2 OHs, and if you put a hydrogen onto one of those OHs, that looks a lot like a molecule we see quite often, H2O, water. So it floats away, and you've taken off an entire hydroxyl group, and it's still got the phosphate, that's dihydroxyacetone phosphate. And so that's how a dehydrogenase can go ahead and take DAP and turn it into glycerol 3-phosphate. You've taken off the hydroxyl group that was different by turning it into water. All right, so both of those end up with glycerol 3-phosphate. Great. Now we have squiggles and we have Lego bricks. I'm going to put them together. So I'm going to go ahead and make the Lego bricks green because I think that's funner and because it'll help keep things a little bit separate. So from here, and putting these together, there's the phosphate in red. All of these things put together, you just literally, you can see you're just putting the squiggles onto slot number 1 and slot number 2 of the glycerol 3-phosphate. The enzyme that does that is called, it has a couple names. I don't remember which one is used in your slides, so make sure and double check that. But one of the names, at least, is glycerol 3-phosphate acyl transferase. Actually, I think it's acyl glycerol 3-phosphate transferase. So AG3P transferase. And it's called transferase because it is taking an acyl group and transferring it onto another molecule. That's what transferases do. They take pieces of one molecule and put them onto a different one. And this guy works twice. First time to put it onto the first spot, second time to put it on the second spot. Wouldn't it be nice if we could just say that was the third time and then we were done, because then we'd be try. But tags don't have a phosphate on the third group. So this is where we get to have a little, I think it's fun. This is where I get to have a little fun, and you guys continue to have about as much fun as you were before. And the pathway splits. So the pathway that's going to be angling to the right here, that's going to be our tag synthesis pathway. It's what we're mainly talking about today. But there is also a pathway for making phospholipids. because this is also where they can come from. First, let's go ahead and name this backbone molecule that I'm outlining in blue. The glycerol, the phosphate, and the two acyl groups all together have a special name because this particular backbone is used for about a dozen different molecules at least. And then you just tweak it to make it. So they named this backbone so they could refer to it easily. It is a phosphatidate. It can also be called phosphatidic acid if it has a hydrogen thrown onto the phosphate. Those are the same thing. Like almost any molecule, you can turn lots of molecules into an acid just by throwing a hydrogen on there, and then they just put ic, acid, on the end. So phosphatidate or phosphatidic acid. Either way, that's this backbone. So how does this backbone lead to tags? We go ahead and throw in, we'll make this all in red over here. All right, so this is a 1, 2, so this is, she's not going to ask you what this one is, but for those of you who like to know what it's all called, it's going to be glycerol. It's 1, 2, it's glycerol. If you have it in the slides, that's I'll go ahead and yell it out. But it's glycerol 1, 2, it's acyl. It's naming this molecule, so it's a glycerol with 2 acyl groups and a phosphate. So 1, 2 acyl glycerol through 3 phosphate. That's what it should be. 1, 2 acyl glycerol 3 phosphate. Except instead of saying 3 phosphate, you say phosphatase. So 1, 2 acyl, G3P, ace. Because we're going to be cutting the phosphate off. So it's a phosphatase. Okay? Make sense? So what we end up with is this, with the phosphate having fallen off. This leaves us ready for the next step of throwing on a last squiggle. And the last squiggle is just going to be this guy again, times 3. G3P transferase. Acyl G3P transferase. So he just comes in, sticks on the last Lego brick, and then you have a triacyl glycerol. TAG, tag. All right, so this thing has a lot of fat, a little bit of sugar, and it is ready to be shipped out to the fat cells. So does anyone want to take a stab at how does the liver get fat or cholesterol or free fatty acids or any of its other hydrophobic goodies? How does it ship those around the body? VLDL, lipoproteins. So we saw those a little while ago, and they're back. So VLDL is going to be stuffed full of things that blood really doesn't like. Hydrophobic tags. It'll also have cholesterol. It'll also have some free fatty acids. And it can also have some other hydrophobic things stuffed inside of it, like vitamin A, vitamin E, vitamin K, vitamin D, all the fat-soluble vitamins, A, E, and K. And then VLDL will be thrown out into the blood. Oh, there's one other thing. What makes VLDL, what is on the surface of VLDL that makes it a lipoprotein? We have the lipo, that's what it's filled with. Apoproteins, APO100, ApoB100. So we have apoproteins. This one will be B100. And then it's got two others. Anyone remember the other apoproteins?
48.
48 is on a different kind of lipoprotein. So that is one for a different guy. VLDL has two others, though. C, excellent. And E. C. Apo-C. I see you. No one even groaned. All right. And Apo-E. Apo-C helps cut the stuff out using lipase. Apo-E says hello and helps it bind to the cells as it is formed. So this goes out into the blood. To go find, in particular, since we are in the fed state, not that many cells are going to be asking for tags in particular. A few of them might, but tags are just most of the time. Most of them are saturated fats, so they're not special. And glycerol, that's it. Most cells, they might ask for a few for their membrane or something like that, but most of it, in the fed state, no one's desperate for fuel, so it all goes to the fat cells. If we were in starvation state, we wouldn't be making tags, for one thing. We'd be releasing them from the fat cells. But then that might be when everyone's like, I'll take fat as a fuel, we're starving. Right now we just made it, fed state, going to the fat cells. Ends up at the fat cells, you use ApoE to bind, ApoC to cut all the stuff out, you throw it into the fat cells. The fat cells do a really weird thing that you don't need to know in detail, but it's just kind of to mention it. They actually take the tags completely apart to get them in, and then they put them all the way back together because we're efficient like that. And it explains a lot about humans. So then we got tags all thrown together in the cells, and yeah, that's stored. So, question.
How does the cell, the liver cell?
So this is happening in the cytosol. Any other questions?
Does the FAS stand for a big circle?
This is fatty acid synthase from fatty acid synthesis, a different pathway. It's where we made our new acyl groups or fatty acids from. Any other questions?
So when it's in the dye form, DAG is when it's actually a phosphatase. If it goes down to a MAG or mono, it's not a phosphatase?
So DAG and MAG would be when there are less. So you could call this a DAG because there's only diacylglycerol, and MAG would be if there is one. However, the phosphate has come off, so it's no longer a phospholipid or anything. Okay. So there's no phospholipid going on in there, if that was your question?
Yeah.
Okay. One other thing, disease state. So, if you didn't have apoproteins, let's say that there was someone that had a protein deficiency. It's not super common in the US, but it can happen, especially if we're talking about specific proteins, apoproteins. And then there can also be a general protein deficiency where you get ascites and that sort of a thing going on. If you didn't have protein, what would your VLDL do? Wouldn't be recognized, wouldn't...
High level? Would it be a high level in your blood?
So, high level in your blood, that is true, and something else actually happens as well. So all of these, the comments that were made were that it might not bind, that you might have a hard time finding the target cell, that it might build up in the blood. All good observations, all do happen. Something else happens too, though. The liver tries to not let it leave because it's not ready. It doesn't have the proteins, and therefore the liver says, this isn't ready to go yet, and so it holds on to it. but you keep making more. And so you keep holding on to it, and it builds up and it builds up. And then you have a liver that is full of fat, which is called fatty liver disease. If that goes on long enough, fatty liver disease will progress. Does anyone know what it progresses into? It can get to liver cirrhosis. Don't spell like I spell. All right. Fatty liver disease, reversible. Get them some protein, stop getting whatever's making so many tags, alcohol. So if you drink a lot, if you binge drink, you can overwhelm the amount of apoproteins you have, especially if you're doing it night after night. You run out of apoproteins, even though you don't have a general protein deficiency. These guys start building up in the liver. Once they get wedged inside the liver, even if you get more proteins in, they're not going to like flow out like, water through a hose. It's going to be hard to get them out of the liver. Possible, but it's not like eat some protein and all of a sudden your liver instantly can reverse everything quickly. It takes time. So alcohol, run out of apoproteins, wedge it into your liver, repeat that enough, fatty liver disease. Then you can go ahead and slowly reverse that if you stop damaging it. But if you don't, eventually your liver starts having functions stop working and die off irreversibly. And that's cirrhosis. Cirrhosis, as far as it's irreversible because it's basically liver death. It is possible to have portions of the liver cirrhosed and portions not. So there is that. But yeah, so that's part of tag transit when it goes wrong. And yeah. Now, we've talked about tags. Let's talk about this offshoot over here. This, if we don't take the phosphate off, what are we going to end up with? We have a squiggle there, we have a squiggle there. We still have the phosphate. And the body can actually make, so question for you, phosphates. They look like this. Phosphate, oxygen, 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 oxygen. Phosphate molecule surrounded by a bunch of electronegative oxygens. Is that going to be hydrophilic or hydrophobic? Hydrophilic. Charge means hydrophilic. More charged, the more hydrophilic. This guy's got a frick ton of charges. And so a phosphate is actually a really good group, even though the rest of this, all the stuff in green right here, is completely hydrophobic, or at least really close to completely. The glycerol has a little bit, but we don't care. It's very hydrophobic. So the phosphate, however, is hydrophilic. This black line, I'm going to go ahead and, let's see, phosphate, glycerol, acyl group, glycerol, acyl group, phosphate. We have a bilayer lipid membrane. And it's made up of phospholipids that come from the same tag pathway offshoot. And the phosphates face out towards all the water. The acyl groups and portions of the glycerol face inward, trying to avoid the water as much as possible. And the glycerol is actually more bent. And so what they usually draw in the textbooks like this and then they draw another one down here, is just a simplified version of a phospholipid. There are lots of different kinds of phospholipids, and I'm not going to launch into the whole thing. This is actually, I cover this when I do tags, whether phospholipids come up or not, because it's the easiest way to integrate the pathway into the whole scheme of things. Phospholipids, whereas tags will add a saturated fat into the third spot with the phosphate removed, Phospholipids will add onto the end of the phosphate, and they'll add typically a specialized fatty acid. And that specialized fatty acid makes so that it has special actions in this phospholipid. So, for example, this blue part, the fatty acid, could be...
And they leave the phosphate group on?
They do. And that way it has a very hydrophilic portion, which lets it have a lot of dynamic actions. So one of the examples is inositol. You guys have had physiology. Phosphatidylinositol, IP3, DAG, all of those are a phosphatidate with an inositol on the end, and then those are put into the membrane, and when the G protein comes through and sends something to phospholipase C to cut something in half, the thing it's cutting in half is phosphatidate, inositol, phosphatidylinositol. Cut that in half. One half of it's called diacylglycerol. Minus the phosphate right here, that's DAG. That goes one way. And then IP3, inositol 3-phosphate. Inositol with a phosphate on the third spot of the remaining portion of the molecule. And so we've seen this before, and it's all coming back into a whole circle here. So you have inositol. There's also things like choline, serine, and ethanolamine. And we'll get into those more if we have time today or next week. So that is tag synthesis and its brother, phospholipid synthesis, the beginnings of it. Any questions on that? All right, would you guys like me to quiz you, or would we like to move on to Fizz, or what's your preference? Quiz. All right, let's see. Okay, without looking at your notes, preferably, because recall will help. What are the two pathways that you can make glycerol 3-phosphate? I'm just looking mainly for the enzyme. And actually, let's do one at a time. Which enzyme is found only in the liver that helps you make glycerol 3-phosphate? I think I heard it. Kinase. Glycerol 3-phosphate kinase. All right, that one is only in the liver, and that's called de novo synthesis because you're making it from scratch. Actually, de novo is kind of a sketchy term. Both of them are sort of part of other things. I have seen it used. I would just leave it alone and just say that it's only in the liver. All right, next question. Without looking at your notes, and this time in your head so everyone has a chance. What is the enzyme for what the liver or the fat cells can do to make glycerol 3-phosphate? We'll give it about 10 seconds. All right, anyone got it? And that one takes an NADH. All right, another question. Once you have finished making a tag, what takes it into the bloodstream? What does the liver do with it? And what can go wrong? Go ahead and think through that. And if you have the answer, try to think why that answer makes sense. Yeah, sure. Question was, once you finish making your tag, what transports it out of the liver? How does it do it when it works right? How can it go wrong? Okay, so it is VLDL, which is a lipoprotein. Lipo is all the lipid stuff in there. It's got cholesterol, it's got fat-soluble vitamins, and tags. Then the protein part is the apoproteins, ApoP100 and C&E. Toss it out in the blood, finds the fat cells, gets put into there, the tags are taken apart, put back together, and moved on. The way it can go wrong is you can run out of protein either because you're protein deficient in general, or because you've had a lot of intake, typically of alcohol, which is an energy-dense molecule, that makes so you make so many tags that you actually run out of the apoproteins. And so your VLDL kind of sits in the liver. Some of it does go out in the blood and will elevate in the blood as well, but a lot of it stays in the liver, builds up. Fatty liver disease, then cirrhosis. Let's see. If someone came into your clinic and you ran a blood test on them and you saw that their lipids were extremely high in the blood, what are 3 different things that might be going on? And you don't need to all have the same 3 things, but at this point I think you can come up with 3 things that might be going on. Not all of them necessarily we're talking about today. Take about another 10 to 12. Okay. Anyone got any ideas? There's not a solid, only one way that this is a right answer kind of a thing. I'll toss out a couple. All right, so one thing that could be going on is they just made a bunch of fat and they just shipped it into the blood. Is that normal? That can be normal. That can be normal after they have just eaten a high sugar or high alcohol meal. If it's a high alcohol meal, I don't know if I'd call it a meal. That might be a little bit less normal, but it's like, is this normal for you? Or, anyway. Then you get a good history. But, so they just ate and they converted it to fat. That can be very normal. That's not worrying. Something else that could be happening, they could have eaten a high fat meal, not a high glucose meal. And that means they could have just absorbed the fat through the intestines, and chylomicrons might be super high if it was really recent. And you could have a bunch of chylomicrons that are still trying to transport it from the intestines to the liver, and that's fat in the bloodstream. I don't know if you've seen a picture of, there was a coyote that unfortunately got hit by a car, but it was right after it had had a very high-fat meal, and because the people who were doing it were nerdy science types, they were like, you can literally see the triglycerides in the arteries right here, and they took a lot of pictures. So you might have that come up in one of your classes. Look forward to it. The other thing, third thing could be that you have, those are the 2 main ones that I wanted to get across. The third one was mostly so that we could see if we had other interesting things come up. One third one that could be happening would be if the liver can't receive chylomicrons, or if you have really high cortisol, stress hormone. That says mobilize glucose, proteins, a little bit, and fat into the bloodstream. So if you have, if you have adrenaline or high cortisol, that can mobilize fat into the bloodstream. So there's the 3 reasons that it might be seen there. Okay, let's see. Anything else? Oh yeah. Would this be, so the tags going into the VLDL right here, is that endogenous or exogenous fat? Endogenous. It was made inside the liver. Exogenous would be chylomicrons. All right, this is kind of a pretty short pathway. I think that if she has anything else, little details in the slides that she wants you to just make sure that there's not anything too much beyond there, but this is kind of the core of it. And
What are the
yeah.
regulatory steps of this?
Okay, so regulatory steps, let's see. Both of these steps, so I'm not saying these are the main regulatory steps, but both of these are regulated. And I believe it's this guy who's the main regulatory, AG3P transferase. So that one you'll have to double check me on, but these guys have regulation. Which one's main? Double check that in the slides.
That would be the committed step.
Committed step, yeah, that should be, I believe that is AG3P transferase. And then the other ones have regulation, but they aren't necessarily the committed steps. They could be, though. Double check which one's which. I just know that they all have stuff poking them.
I did have a quick question. I don't know if it's in direct relation to this. So for the transport of like the small chain, medium chain, and long chain, the small chains and medium chains use albumin, and then the long chains use, is that beta oxidation?
Yeah, that's on beta oxidation. It is a
Okay.
good thing to remember and bring up, because that's a good question.
Okay.
So on the other side, this is when we're making it and storing it, flipping completely around to beta oxidation when we are pulling it out and burning it. Short fatty acids come in many different lengths, short, medium, long, and very long chains. And short and medium chains will be traveling into the liver on albumin. I thought that albumin actually did all of them, to be honest. But definitely when it's in the liver, short and medium are burned in the mitochondria with beta oxidation. Long and very long go to the peroxisome, and they go through different what's that thing with the hydra? Well, peroxidation anyway. Catalase, I believe, is in there somewhere. So yeah, longer chains go to the peroxisome is the point. And there are diseases such as Zellweger's, where you have a problem with the transport, the MCT transporter, I believe it was, on the peroxisomes. So the long chain fatty acids can't get in, can't get burned, and they build up. There's a third reason you can have fat be really high in your blood. Zellweger's disease. You can't get the long chain fatty acids out of the blood. Can't burn them because they don't fit in the mitochondria and they can't go anywhere else. All right. Good deal. So, do we have any other questions on beta oxidation, ketogenesis, or anything else, general biochem? If not, then let's go ahead and take 3 to 5, and then we'll jump into Fizz. Question here.
I saw somewhere where the tags were stored unhydrogenous with no water.
Okay.
So I don't know if that had any extra effects on the body. Why
So
is that relevant? I just saw that in a note somewhere.
tags are going to be stored in fat cells, and they're going to be stored away from water for a couple reasons. One, they're hydrophobic, and two, it's because water can cause, water is slightly charged and can cause reactions, and so if you store anything in water over time, it can get, I don't want to use the word mutate. That doesn't stick around, that's water soluble, and so it's a little less of an issue, but no, I wouldn't say that that's something, glycogen doesn't tend to stay that long, but mainly it's mostly because it's hydrophobic, it'll be stored away from water, and yeah. Question back here?
There's a question on one of the G&G questions, and I want to know if it's right or wrong. Sometimes I think it'll be wrong.
I didn't see one on Try.
But my notes are
I'm printing some out. I got these two. They got lipid biosynthesis and fatty acid metabolism.
yeah, there's an on tomorrow, right?
Yeah.
I would have gone with D myself as
Oh,
well.
look at biosynthesis.
It's the same one.
Kind of a general,
It has multiple.
This is the fatty acid
enzyme,
metabolism.
not 100% say that's wrong,
Oh.
but this I know
Oh,
is doing
never
it
really.
by creating
So it just keeps on.
water,
Week 1, week 2.
and so that is what hydrolase is.
Right.
So it should be, I would go with me.
Yeah.
So I agree.
Okay.
Yeah, no worries. Okay. All right, back in 3. Hopefully you guys were able to find the stream pretty well this time. All right. Cheers.
Too many different names.
And
Now, here,
oil
put this-
away,
That's a fatty
hydrogenase
acid.
belongs to
Like
the
fatty acid.
enzyme, and it's B. It's wrong.
It's the same. This is the oxidation.
It should be a high.
Okay.
There's another.
But it's the same. It was that also.
Yeah.
Which one? Which one?
The number, we'll have to calculate how many
Like
things
acetyl-CoA.
from base oxidation. It said, it was like 9 acetyl-CoA, 8 NADH, and then it said 7 FADH, but shouldn't the NADH and FADH
Be
be
the same?
Yeah.
Was there an option with that? Okay, I don't like this.
It was like 2, when they rounded though, in her notes, it was like 2 to 3, so it was like 5 per cycle, so she had like 1.3 and.
Yeah,
Very
but
little
like,
off.
some, these answers don't make sense.
But if you get the wrong answer that they had on the GNG and she selects it, she gives you the point for it. And then if you prove her wrong, she gives you the point. Here's some hope.
But I don't have time to prove you.
I know.
My God,
Oh, you signed on
I asked
something?
him. He is?
He's
but
still doing it, but I just have to.
it is B, he said it's hydrogen. It's not.
I only did a little bit of supplemental, but it's enough supplemental for today, because I have biochem tomorrow.
You have biochem, I'm gonna do it.
I know, right?
We all have biochem.
And then that supplemental, sit it at the back of her head. I know.
Taylor, nice to have you already on the AANP.
Oh, thanks. Appreciate that.
How much time off did you take?
So I did half load for 6 months. So, yeah.
And then you mentioned that there's a class to learn your learning style.
Yeah.
'Cause I feel like I don't know what my learning style is, but I don't have time to take that class.
So it's a little, go on.
How did you figure it out? Through that class?
So it's a little less about learning styles than it is methods of learning that are foundational. So there are preferred learning styles for sure. And then there are some things about learning that are universal. And the class targets the ones that are universal. That way it hits everybody. Learning styles, I learned a different way. And that actually has more to do with studying personality and preferred focus areas, basically what your go-to tool for analyzing. Everyone can do everything, but the one that you go to first as your personality's preferred tool, you get better at it after you've done it for 20 years versus the other ones you use like 5 minutes every 4 years. So to answer your question, how can you figure out learning things? I would start with the foundational ones, and those ones will sound a little familiar: chunking, active recall, spaced repetition for memory, time thinking about it and hearing about it in different viewpoints and thinking about it again, and then trying to apply it for understanding. There are some other things as well that we could go into, such as how long you can maintain focus and before you start having poor memory implantation, so you need a break. So that's like the Pomodoro technique, if you've heard of that, okay. And then there's applying focused learning versus diffuse learning, which is when you're focused is when you're thinking really hard about something and you're trying to make it get to a certain point. Diffuse is when you're sort of idly thinking about it, and that opens up a lot more unrelated synapses that seem like they don't have anything to do with it, and you're kind of idly going through stuff, and that makes you more creative because now you're seeing more things and connections are made between what otherwise when you're focused wouldn't. Everyone works that way. To give them justice, it would take a little while, but yeah, I'd say I'd love to have like a 10-minute conversation or something sometime if you wanted to have a list of them and you could pick what you wanted to go for. So, yeah.
Thank you.
No worries. So let's go ahead and jump into Fizz. Am I good to erase this? All right. And we are same. That was really. I love how visible these markers are.
We do too.
Thank you. I bet you
We
do.
really did it for ourselves.
My gosh. Well, please be selfish more often. All right.
You need to get someone off at me because you complain every time.
Right.
Well, it was beautiful. All right. Fizz. So, Fizz is actually kind of a fun topic in my opinion. It's the heart. Yay. So,
I've never been confused in this class until this lesson. I spent a day just figuring out where we were.
right? Yeah.
The
it's
heart,
like
okay, got it.
Fizz is your best friend, and then bam. Yeah. There's about 3 lectures throughout all of Fizz where it's like, this is great, and then you hit one of them, and it's just like, I have no idea. Who are you? It's just. Then you go read his blog, and you're like, oh, you've always been like this.
He has a blog.
He does.
Schmidt has a blog.
He does.
He does.
And it has so many citations. It has, like, it'll make you weep.
Well, he had like a beeper or something, so I didn't think he was even like. taking
has a
blog.
Oh, yeah. He's got a blog. And let me tell you, it's like the master blog. It's practically linked up to his scholarly article. Yeah.
Go find him. Oh my God, that's what's going on with that.
Well, because he showed up on the SCN and like the tag and I'm like, wow.
Are you friends with Dr. Schmidt on Facebook?
I don't know. I don't know.
Who wouldn't be? No.
He has a Facebook.
I hope not. He does.
I actually didn't know I had a Facebook either.
People love him.
Macro, abnormal. All right, so we kind of got 3 categories. Zeroing back in on Fizz, we're going to take down 1/3 of the difficult Fizz lectures because the other ones are on, I believe it was kidneys. That's fun. But this one's about the heart. So the way we're going to break this up today is we're going to start with the macroscopic, what the freak is going on in the heart. And it's basically following the simple thing from a zoomed out. You're not in med school, you're a normal person, you're not insane, this is what you might want to know, and then you'd walk away. Second thing we're going to go into is going to be when that goes wrong. What does that look like? Diseases, basically. And we'll also throw in a little bit of cardiac ECG. And then the third thing we'll do is zoom in. And I'm just going to say micro, normal heart. And this is looking at, that's illegible, but there you go. This is looking at the way the heart actually depolarizes, what is actually going on with the ions. And thankfully, it's not too bad as long as you don't have too much going on in your head at once. So let's go ahead and lay the foundation for February 14th. So,
Yeah, what is going on?
this atria, ventricles, we got a little sinoatrial node. Sinoatrial node. Then, right here, we have an AV node, atrioventricular node. Further down, we have, coming off of the AV nodes, several fibers. Anybody want to take a stab at what these are called?
There's the septum or the Purkinje.
Yes, Purkinje fibers, also known as the bundle of His. I'm just going to write His. And they are going through the septum. Excellent. And they go all the way down to here. Normal heart. Normal heart beats between 60 to 100 times per minute, with the sinoatrial node, SA node, being what sets that rhythm. If it is above 100 beats a minute, it has a special name. Anyone want to take a stab? Tachycardia. Excellent. If it's below 60, it's got a special term. Bradycardia. So we have tachy and brady. All right. Sinoatrial node controlling the speed, typically between 60 to 100. Okay. Now, when the sinoatrial node starts a heartbeat, it's also known as the pacemaker node. There are two pacemaker nodes, but this is the primary one. The other one is the AV node. We'll get to that. The sinoatrial node is going to discharge some electricity through ion exchange, which we'll go into later. When it does that, the sinoatrial node, let's see, no one can see. Can you guys actually see over here? Yes? Okay. Then we'll go right here. So this green box represents the sinoatrial node. And when it does its magic and starts energy going across its membrane, magic we'll talk about later, it actually is connected to neighboring muscle cells. And those neighboring muscle cells are connected to their neighboring muscle cells. And they're actually connected more like on all sides. And so when this depolarization, this membrane has an action potential jiggity-jaggeting across it, which is really just ions flowing across it, but they have charge and therefore it's electrical. Ions going across the membrane, well, they go across this membrane that's connected between the two, and all of a sudden you have that happening in the next cell. And then the cell will shoot off a bunch of calcium from its sarcoplasmic reticulum, which continues the action potential. And it goes through here, goes to the next one, calcium, continues it, goes through there, et cetera, et cetera. The trick that I want you to pull from this is what these little passageways are called. Anyone want to take a stab?
Gap junctions.
Gap junctions. Excellent, thank you. Gap junctions. More than just electricity can go across the gap junctions, but that's what we care about today. Do skeletal muscle cells have gap junctions? No. Cardiac has gap junctions. All right. So, sinoatrial node starts its magic, and this is what it looks like on kind of a big scale. I'm going to draw this kind of in a sequence here. So, first, all the muscle cells near it fire off, start contracting. They pass it to all the ones near them. They pass it to all the ones near them. And on the ripple flows. And it continues across even the septum between the atria. It does not go across this insulated septum between the atria and the ventricles. So just the sinoatrial node firing off sent it through everybody. The atria will contract, so they squeeze, and then the blood is squeezed out of the atria, down into the ventricles. The ventricles, how much signal have they gotten as of now? None. What's going on with that is sinoatrial node actually sends some signal down a special nerve-like fiber, and that goes to the AV node, and it actually reaches the AV node pretty quick. Once it hits the AV node slows it down, not by necessarily trying to slow it down, just the way that the gap junctions and the nerve fibers, the Purkinje fibers in particular, bundle of His in particular. So I'm going to circle bundle of His for speed. Makes it transduce slowly down to the tip of the ventricles, giving enough time to the atria for their ripple effect to go across the entire top, contract, squeeze out the blood, relax, and then the same thing that triggered them finally reaches the bottom of the ventricles. And we start a ripple effect. From the bottom towards the top. There are no gap junctions, notice, between the atria and the ventricles. But through the SA node, the AV node, and the bundle of His, the same originating impulse is what eventually starts it down at the tip of the ventricles. But the atria and the ventricles don't talk to each other. This matters because sometimes it's possible to just have the atria firing if something goes wrong lower down. Or we'll get into how later, but you can have them de-rhythmatized and sorts of things like that. But one thing that I do want to point out now is that by starting the impulse at the bottom of the ventricles after the atria have finished squeezing, all the blood is able to come to the ventricles and they're not trying to squeeze it out, for one. For number two, now the ventricles, so atria, we're trying to move blood this way. So it makes sense that they're going to start squeezing from the top. I didn't show it very well in this one, but they actually both start squeezing more or less from the top. This one's from roughly here. And squeeze down. This guy's trying to squeeze blood. Here's our aorta. Where does that go? Systemic. So I'm just going to write body. And then over here, we've got another one. Where does he go? Right ventricle, lungs, I heard. Lungs. And then the lungs would do their little swizzle bit and dump it into the atria and all that. So squeezing from the bottom of the ventricles actually makes sense because we're physically going to be moving the blood, like wringing it out up through here. The reason I'm making such a big point of that is because if you can visualize what is happening in here, then all of the valves moving, classes, if you can remember how the ventricles are moving and the fact that if you can visualize the blood, then you can see how the blood would slam closed these one-way doors as the pressure builds up, and that would give you a sound, and it would open these because it's squeezing, and so one-way doors that let it out would open, one-way doors that only let something in would slam closed, that kind of a thing. We're not going to spend too much time on that today, but wanted to make sure that you start thinking that way. So, what we've talked about is basically rippling out, slow transduction, rippling out for macroscopic normal heart contraction. Now, we have one more normal thing, the AV node. The AV node has a pacemaker function that runs at roughly 40 beats per minute. The SA node sends something through anyway, and it resets the whole thing, and so the AV node never gets to do anything, and that's fine, because it's a backup. But if it did go, it would be at 40 beats per minute, and it would be firing down these bundle of His fibers and controlling the ventricles and getting them to squeeze at least at 40 beats a minute. Why do we have a backup specifically for the ventricles versus the atria, do you think? Thank you. Excellent. Atria have gravity on their side. And so actually, it's really fascinating to me, the majority of blood is moved by gravity. The squeezing of the atria is only, and I'm making this number up, but it's roughly 10 to 20% of what's in the atria. That's how much you're actually squeezing. The rest of it just sloshes down through gravity, the vast majority of it. So if your atria stop firing, might be a problem for exercise, might be a problem for something like that, but you can survive. If your ventricles stop firing, gravity does not move this way. So your body and your lungs, they're going to get oxygen and blood deficient, and that's bad. Then you die. So we have a backup in the AV node to make sure that that'll fire at least some. But we don't want to fire it out of rhythm, so we have the SA node going faster and resetting it to nothing most of the time when it's functioning normally. All right, so that is what is normally going on in the heart. Next topic, what happens when it goes wrong? right, what's this node called? SA node. What's this node called?
AV.
AV. What are these thingies called? Purkinje or His. Good. All right. After these, let's see. Right. Okay. So, in order to really talk about these guys, let's talk about a normal EKG. EKG has a P wave, a Q, R, and S wave that are so close together, we call them the QRS complex, and a T wave. Now, there are details, and I'm going to encourage you to look at segments and intervals on your own time. We're not going to hit those, but they are important and worth hitting. So the P to R, P to S, P to Q, whatever, interval and segment, and QRS to T, interval and segment, those are things you should know. But we're going to talk about concepts first. The P wave and part of the QRS wave have to do with the atria. When this ripple started, that was the energy moving, and shortly after the energy was the contraction. This is watching the energy, not the contraction. So this bump, that's the beginning of the SA node sending out its wave through the atria. So this is atrial depolarization, or atrial go button. Okay? Atria, go. QRS complex. The reason it looks so janky is because, a couple reasons, but one of the reasons is because there's two things going on there. We're going to talk about one right now, the atrial side of the story. That is atrial repolarization. Atrial stop. So after all this wave has gone through, we have a resting period. The cells, even if another wave came through right then, they couldn't fire off. It's called refractory phase. They're tired. Once they've rested enough, then they're ready to go again.
The whole P through S is the refractory.
So in the middle of the QRS complex, is the P through the QRS is refractory or resting. So we have the atrial starting to go, just the energy, then the atria ready to go again. So they've stopped, they're rested. Now, the reason I made a point of that is because it can get kind of dicey to try to keep things straight.
So what do you mean go and stop if they're at rest?
Depolarization, repolarization. Starting to contract, ready to contract again. And so go and stop I just find easier than throwing repolarization, depolarization, which are words that sometimes, especially when they're new or newer in this context, it's like, what does that word mean again? And it's not terribly helpful. So go and stop, or replace them with whatever makes the most sense to you. Did I answer your question okay? All right. So QRS complex, let's see. The other thing is going to be ventricles. And it's the same thing. Ventricular depolarization is going to be inside the QRS. That's the other of the two things I mentioned that the QRS has mashed inside of it. Both of those are going on at the same time. Atrial repolarization, ventricular depolarization. And that's why they just happen to be happening at the same time. The ventricles have just started getting their impulse to contract right as the atria are relaxing, which makes sense. Because otherwise we'd have some issues with them fighting over here. You don't want them to be going at the same time. So you have, go, and then the T wave is the repolarization of the ventricles. So 2 atria things, 2 ventricle things. The middle one shares. Make sense? Awesome. All right, then we can move forward to the fun stuff. Diseases. So, AV block. Got a question for you. AV block is when the communication to the AV node is disrupted. If the SA node can't talk to the AV node, but the SA node is still functioning, and the AV node is still functioning, it's called AV block. Take a few seconds and think about, what do you think would happen? I'm not going to ask you to say what it is, but go ahead and see if you can figure out what should happen with that particular issue. A few more seconds and then we'll dive in. All right. So what happens, the SA node still works. So it's going to still fire off its ripple. I'm not going to draw the ripple all the way through here, but it fires off its ripple. The atria go just fine at between 60 and 100 beats per minute. So we'll say 80. AV node doesn't ever get SA's signal, so he's going to fall back on his own 40 beats a minute signal. So we have the SA node going 80 times a minute. We have the AV node going 40 times a minute. Atria contract twice as often as the ventricles. That looks like this. P wave, nothing. Well, there'd be a little atrial recalibration there, but nothing big. Another P wave, then QRS, then T. So we had 2 P waves before we got 1 QRS, a 2-to-1 ratio. Does it make sense why? This pacemaker is twice as fast than this pacemaker, and this one can't send a signal there, so the backup is being used for the bottom of the heart. So the atria squeeze twice for every 1 time down here, and they're no longer in rhythm with each other, which can lead to interesting issues. This is AV block. Next disease, atrial fibrillation, AFib. So, I've got a question for you guys. Does anyone know what fibrillation is or means? All right. So, imagine a water balloon. If you were holding a water balloon and you squeezed really hard all together, it would bulge out the top, right? That's building up pressure, and that's what the heart is usually supposed to do. It all squeezes together, it builds up pressure, it makes, instead of a bulge, it shoots the blood out. However, if you take a water balloon and instead of squeezing all of the parts at the same time, you just squeeze a little bit here and a little bit here, and you just kind of do this finger squeezing where all the fingers are squeezing at different times, you're not going to get very much pressure built up. And that's fibrillation. It's when all the cells are in resting state and contracting state at different times. And so they aren't moving in concert. And so they can't build up very much pressure. And so really, they're just sort of sloshing the blood around. They're not actually squeezing it or moving it almost at all. When it's in the atria, we call it AFib. And that looks like this. QRS, T, and even the QRS would be all jiggity. Because the atria are firing all the time, just really wussy. And so it's kind of a sawtooth looking pattern. AFib is when you've got it trying to go 300 times a minute, and so everybody doesn't have time to rest, and so some of them can go, some of them can't, and it's a problem. So your atria are next to useless. Can you survive AFib though? Can you survive without your atria? Yes. Gravity. That leads us to our next one, VFib.
How does the medication for AFib work?
That's a good question. I think that the medication, since it's trying to go at roughly 300 times a minute, you're trying to put parasympathetic pressure on the SA node to tell it to chill out and drop how often the SA node is telling it to go. There can be other causes of AFib besides an SA node going crazy, but those are the ones where you'd probably use a defibrillator, and they would probably not be consistent. There might be some others, but you would probably do some parasympathetic drugs so that you're slowing down the SA nodes firing. Interesting thing with AFib, by the way. There are two other diseases that I'd like to bring up now because it took a while to put this together. Atrial flutter and atrial tachycardia. I'm not going to go into them a lot, but just so that you have the concept, AFib is stupid crazy fast, not working at all. Flutter is really fast, not working very well. Tachy is fast. It's starting to not work great. So fast, faster, fastest. And it's all just speeding up until it's completely useless. All of these are considered different diseases inside of a certain bracket of how often you're telling it to go. VFib. VFib is kind of like AFib, except it's happening in the ventricles. You got the ventricles doing the balloon sloshy thing, and they can't send blood anywhere. And this is the one that kills people. This is actually what kills people after a heart attack. It isn't the heart attack itself most of the time. It's the fact that the heart attack gets the rhythm out of sync, and then the heart fails to get it back into a rhythm. And so then it can't move the blood properly. So VFib is going to look something like this. Maybe there'll be a little bit there, a little bit there. So you still have your atria doing their thing, okay, but everything else is next to non-existent, and it's just jiggity all over the place. So, last one. My favorite one. Ectopic. So, last time I talked about this, someone actually remembered somewhere else that the word ectopic comes up. Does anyone know where else ectopic? Have you heard ectopic anywhere else?
Pregnancy?
Ectopic pregnancy. So, anyone know what that means? Ectopic?
Outside of the fallopian tube?
In the fallopian tubes. So, it should be in the uterine wall where it implants. It's not. It's in a different place. It's in the fallopian tubes. This is the same idea, except instead of, you don't have pregnancy in your heart. You're not that bad. But you do have, instead of your sinoatrial node or your AV node, you have this guy right here. Or right here, or right here, or right here, or right here. Anywhere in the heart where one cell that has gap junctions all around it is somehow mutated, becoming cancer, trauma, anything that makes it depolarize regularly. And then as soon as it starts depolarizing regularly, it sends out ripples because it's connected to everybody by gap junctions. And it starts its own ripple effect, ectopically, from a different origin, a different location. So while that guy does that, you have the normal wave come through, and just like a forest fire, if this place is already burned up or already used up, and there are no trees there in a forest fire, the forest fire can't go through a place that's already been burned. That's why they do pre-burns sometimes to make a fire break. In this case, these guys have already worked. They are tired. They can't do anything. And so the wave can't be sent through their gap junctions, and so you get this. And then you might have this going around over here if they've had enough time to rest up here. And that's not supposed to be sending a wave in that timing. And so then it's really janky up there. And that's what an ectopic rhythm can do. And that guy will go off wherever the heck he wants, whatever timing he does. And it looks sort of like So there's a normal EKG roughly. And ectopic, well, if it steals some of the ventricular, then the ventricular would be smaller. And if it did it earlier, then the ventricular could be earlier. So you have a shorter QRS and then a mini QRS that's earlier. What if it was one in the atria? You make your atria smaller, and you have a little earlier P wave type deal. Or they can look really janky and not look like any wave, because cancer can do anything it wants, including like growing teeth out of your elbows or something. It's like, that's called teratoma. So yeah, basically ectopic will make it look janky in a whole lot of different ways. Okay, so those are the diseases. Lastly,
So defibrillator during like CPR is for VFib, it resets it?
yeah. So imagine if you took, so instead of ions, which is what all of this relies on, the SA node's trying to say, send ions, and only like 20 out of 2,000 cells have any ions, so those are the only ones that go off right then. Not going to be in order. But if you actually apply, literally, electricity, you don't need to wait for ions to be there, because we already have the electricity. And you stick that in there, you fire all the cells in the heart at the same time. The heart does a very unnatural thing where the entire heart contracts. Not super useful right then, but then the whole thing relaxes at the same time. They're all in the resting state. And then when the SA node fires next time, everybody is ready to hear it. And then that sets it hopefully back into a normal rate and rhythm. All right, last topic. What the freak is going on with all the ions zoomed in? Thankfully, this isn't too bad. All right, so we have the SA node and the AV node, and they both look basically the same. So we'll put them over here. And then we have atrial muscle or ventricular muscle, and they also look basically the same to each other. I think I'm going to give myself a little bit more room here. All right, so we have cardiac muscle cells. Over here, we have node cells, SA or AV. We're going to start with the cardiac muscle cells. They have nothing going on at first, so their electrical potential is flat. Then, through a gap junction, a neighboring cell sends the ripple to them, and that shoots them up, opens their sodium channels for phase 0, sodium rushing in. Sodium is positively charged. Sodium coming in moves the charge of the cell up. That's phase 0. Once you get high enough, the cell responds to having, oh, I have this kind of a charge. That tells me that I will open this gate. And the gate actually is magnetically controlled, so it's like literally it can't help but open when it's at that charge. All of these are basically magnetically or electrically controlled.
What does the CM stand for?
Cardiac muscle. CM stands for cardiac muscle. All right, so once you get up high enough, then you're going to have the potassium open and flow out. The potassium channels open and flow out. And the sodium channels will go ahead and close. So I'm just going to write sodium close in red right there. Those two things happen in stage 1. Now, in a normal action potential, you would have the potassium drive it all the way down into the negative, and the potassium would just keep leaving the cell until the cell was back into negative. This, however, in the cardiac cells, we have another ion coming into play. For phases 2 and 3. Phase, and that is calcium. Calcium in, calcium out, or calcium closing. This calcium is coming from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And phases 2 and 3 are kind of the calcium phases. Or to put it another way, see how this kind of goes out flat? It's not quite flat. It's slowly going down. It's a plateau. This particular phase, if this makes sense, it helps keep organized the rest of everything else, because this is the only thing that is really different in the
Skeletal muscle?
versus skeletal muscle. So when we have potassium rushing out, a lot of positive charge leaving. If we add calcium in, you have positive charge leaving and positive charge coming in, and they balance each other out. So you have them moving in both directions, and that holds the electrical potential in the same place. This is when the heart is contracting. The longer you hold that plateau, the longer the heart, and the harder the heart contracts. And so when they have a positive inotropic, a term that we didn't get to super lots, but inotropic means squeeze harder, you're extending the plateau phase. So you have calcium coming in at phase 2, and you keep phase 2 going longer. Phase 3 is when you turn the calcium off. If you just remember that phase 2 and 3 are calcium starting and calcium ending, calcium holds it up, calcium stops holding it up. That's literally all there is to it. Once calcium stops holding it up, potassium will do what potassium does and drive it down into the ground. And then it will equilibrate phase 4. When the potassium channels all close.
Can you go over all those little things that you're writing? Can you go over that one more time?
Yes.
So 0 is sodium in.
0 is gap junctions just came and said, hey, electrical impulse. 0, sodium in. 1, you get up there, potassium channels open to let potassium out. And the sodium channels also close with phase 1. So sodium closes, potassium opens, both are phase 1. Then we come to the calcium phases, phases 2 and 3. Phase 2, calcium comes in to fight the potassium. So calcium's coming in while potassium's going out. Charge remains almost the same. Then the calcium stops and closes for phase 3, and you have a huge drop off because now there's only potassium leaving. And so you're losing a whole bunch of positive things with no positives to replace it. Therefore, you go negative, you go down. Then the very last one is you've tanked as far down as you're going to, and you close the potassium channel. So one more time without all of my jabber in between. Phase 0, sodium in. Phase 1, potassium out and sodium channels close. Phase 2, calcium in. Phase 3, calcium channels close. Phase 4, potassium channels close. Again, the easiest way to keep track of all of this is if you know the 2 calcium phases, calcium in, calcium stops, forming the plateau, and you can remember that that's fighting potassium, all the rest of it can be reasoned out.
And the inotropic definition again was force.
Inotropic is the force of contraction that the heart muscle is doing. A positive inotropic means squeeze harder. Positive inotropic effect. A negative inotropic effect means squeeze softer, which you don't normally get that one. Usually it's squeeze more or stay the same.
So when we're talking about contraction of the heart, is that really in relation to the ventricles?
Yeah, the ventricles are the more important one of the 2. So technically both of them, but the ventricles are the ones where you see a really big change. because the atria are already almost doing nothing. Not really, but almost. So that's cardiac muscle cells. Understanding that, node cells aren't bad. They just have really two differences. So let's go ahead here.
They call node cells anything else?
Node cells are SA node or AV node. And I'm going to go ahead and not make this whole thing green because that'll drive me nuts. All right. I think it'll be more visible. All right. So we still have a spike, we still have a drop off, but we have no plateau. And then we have a gradual increase until we hit another spike and another drop off. So the gradual increase is one of the changes. The lack of a plateau is the other big change. So over here, stage 4 or phase 4 was when it was flat because no gates were open. That's different here. We actually have a tiny little gate open called the sodium funny channel. And it lets sodium in just a little bit, and therefore positive charge climbing just a little bit all the time. And after sodium's had enough time to build up 100 sodiums or who knows whatever, then it finally gets high enough to open other channels that'll do a spike and a drop, just like a normal action potential. Now, the spike is going to be, that whole thing where it's slowly building, the funny channels, those are phase 4. Just like phase 4 over here was the resting phase, it's just that the resting phase here has funny channels making it slowly build up when it should be resting. And then eventually, as soon as, however long it takes to hit that threshold to do the spiking phase, which is going to be phase 0, which was phase 0 over here, where it spikes up. This is what makes our resting heart rhythm. Funny channel, how long does it take to get enough sodiums to make a spike through a tiny sodium channel? Now, phase 0 over here, we don't have a plateau phase where we play with calcium. We have this phase is where calcium comes in. So the plateau is gone, and so instead of seeing calcium at the plateau, we see calcium at phase 0. And so this is a calcium spike, not a sodium spike. Okay? So 4, funny channel. 0, calcium spike. And then we have phase 3, which they just used to call it the drop phase. The reason they did that is because over here, right after 3, was when you had your huge drop in the cardiac muscle cells. And so they're like, well, it's a huge drop. Should we call it phase 1 or call it phase 3? I wish they called it phase 1, so of course they called it phase 3. Phase 3 is going to be potassium leaving the cell. And then that goes all the way down, and you re-enter phase 4. So it goes 403, 403, 403. 4 is the funny, 0 is a calcium spike, 3 is normal potassium correction spike. So, concept question, and this is without hopefully looking at notes, it's up to you. What is starting the depolarization of a muscle cell?
Sodium?
That's a correct answer. The one I'm looking for, though, is what makes that sodium thing actually trigger. Is it a funny channel, or is it a gap junction?
Gap junction.
Gap junction. So funny channels are for the nodes. Gap junction is what starts the impulse in the cells, the muscle cells. And with that,
So where's the T-tubules?
oh, T-tubules. So let me draw something for that, honestly. So here's a cell, there's a gap junction, here's another cell, doodle-doodle-doo, doodle-doodle-doo. All right, we have some electricity coming in here, and we have muscle fibers. I'm going to draw like this. We have muscle fibers going down the middle, and this is not quite like what they look like, but I'm just doing kind of a concept sketch. So if the electricity stayed around the outside, this middle muscle would only be sort of close when the electricity was right here, and the rest of it would have to like proliferate through here. And the sarcoplasmic reticulum that we talked about earlier, which is these guys are trying to reach sarcoplasmic reticulum that's full of calcium, and then the calcium would be dumped out. Well, the calcium would be dumped out first around the edges, right? Because that's where the charge is. Charge tells calcium to come out. So that would mean that this first guy, this last guy, they get a lot more calcium a lot faster. They squeeze, and then later, a little bit, this middle guy squeezes. So T-tubules fix the problem of the middle guy being left out, or the several middle guys. They actually make the membrane, instead of looking like a box like this, they do this kind of a deal where they have this poking in over or around or under this muscle cell in, so that when the discharge happens, it follows the membrane, which goes all the way into the middle of the cell. And so if you had a water balloon, again, one that can't pop, and you poked a finger into it, that's what a T-tubule looks like. It's just a finger going in towards the center, and then all around the finger you'd have electrical impulse. Anything that was in the middle of the water balloon would then get electricity just as fast as everything around the outside. That's a T-tubule. So they're on everybody.
So they're in both cells?
Yeah. Yep.
Muscle cells?
T-tubules are in all of the cardiac muscle cells, and they go in just so that they all fire in all of their internal actin myosin filaments will contract roughly the same time. Question?
So this 4031, it's, what is it called? The node action potential nodal?
SA or AV nodes. It's the pacemaker function of the SA or AV nodes.
So, how is it related to, I mean, I guess I know it's an action potential. Or how is it related to the action potential?
So this is what's going to form the, I've been calling it an action potential. It's a little bit different. It's going to form basically an action potential along the membrane, because as soon as you have, if you remember in axons, what makes an action potential is ions going in and out, and that makes so that you have a different charge on either side of the membrane. This is also ions going in and out of the cell, in right here and out over there, and that charges the membrane. So this is showing what triggers the doors for the ions to open to start the essentially action potential. Yeah.
But they don't call it action potential, they call it pacemaker.
Pacemaker would be the rhythm, and yeah, you call it a pacemaker cell because it has a rhythm of making what's essentially an action potential. I think that they have a special name for it besides action potential. That's like electrical discharge or cardiac impulse or something like that. But it's an action potential. It's just not a nerve cell. So it's like, oh, we can't call it that because it's a nerve cell. Or maybe they do call it that. But I seem to recall that there's I think some books do call it an action. Some professors do call it an action potential. But I think that it has a technical name that no one cares about. At least no one whose name is me.
It has nothing to do with chronotropic.
Chronotropic would be if you opened more funny channels, and then that would speed it up. Because then you'd have sodium coming in faster, and so the slope would go sooner. Or if you have fewer funny channels, then the slope is less, and it would take longer to get to the spike. Chronotropic is how often does it fire off the spike.
Not speed, but
Or is?
It is speed.
Oh.
Chrono, meaning time, exactly. So inotropic is strength and force, which is relating to the plateau. Chronotropic is funny channels. How long does it take to get to the spike, aka how fast does the heart beat?
Where are the ryanodine receptors?
Ryanodine receptors. Okay, ryanodine receptors are going to be at the end of the T-tubules. They're kind of more deeply into muscle physiology, I think. Probably in a different lecture, but basically when you have an electrical impulse coming down the T-tubules have to make that electrical impulse mean something, and so they contact some receptors down there. One of the receptors that they contact is the ryanodine. Ryanodine talks to the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and then that shoots a bunch of calcium out. So T-tubule, ryanodine, sarcoplasmic equals calcium. Zoomed in, T-tubule, ryanodine receptor, sarcoplasmic reticulum. If this talks to the ryanodine receptor talks to the sarcoplasmic reticulum, tells it to open its door and let all of that beautiful calcium out so that we can have a muscle contraction.
Okay, one more. So the hyperkalemia and hypokalemia, is that affecting the phase 0 of the pacemaker?
So hyper and hypokalemia, do you know in the context of the question, are you referring to hypo in like the cells or hypo in the blood? Or like as a person as a whole?
Altering action potential, cardiac action.
Okay, so probably like the condition. If you have a lot of potassium outside the cell already, and you open your potassium channels to let potassium out, and there's already potassium out there. So hyperkalemia outside, tons of this already. How much is the potassium that's in the cell going to want to leave? Not much. And so it slows it down, and this is why hyperkalemia can be deadly. Because if your heart stops firing, that's bad. And so if you have hyperkalemia, actually like the lethal injection is potassium. So if you have enough potassium outside, you open those gates, nothing happens, no action potential, nothing rushes out. And then the whole thing stops. Hypokalemia would speed it up. Because then you open the gate and it spikes down even faster. It wouldn't speed it up like, I don't know if it'd speed up the rhythm that much, but it would speed up how fast it was leaving. I'm trying to think what that would actually do to the heart. It would probably speed up the rhythm just a little bit because it would get out faster, and so it would get to phase 4 faster, so it would increase chronotropically just a bit.
So hyper and hypo are pertaining to the gates that are the number of gates.
Hyper and hypokalemia is referring to how much potassium you have outside the cells. If it's hyper, meaning you have tons of potassium, then it's hard to get more potassium out there. If it's hypo, it's easier to get potassium to go out there. So if it's hard to get it out there, you slow down, maybe to the point of death. If it's hypo, it's easy to get it out there, so you speed up, maybe to the point of like tachycardia or something. All right. Hopefully this helped. Good luck with your quiz, and catch you guys later. Cheers, guys. Hopefully it was more visible this time. We need more doctors. Stick to it.
Just coughing out the lung.